They say animals can sense danger before we do. Something about their instincts, their heightened awareness of the world around them. I didn't believe it. Not at first. But now, when I think back to those 2 days I spent in that house, I wonder if the dog knew something I didn't. Maybe the cat was trying to warn me. Or maybe I should have never stepped foot inside that place. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Also, leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Now, back to my story. It wasn't just a house, though. It started long before I arrived. Small things I ignored, signs I brushed off as coincidences. And then, the rules, the notes, the sounds at night. Looking back, I can't believe I stayed. But I thought it was just another pet sitting gig, just another easy paycheck. I was wrong. I was in my final year of college, juggling late-night study sessions with part-time gigs to pay the bills. When I saw the pet sitting ad, I thought it was perfect. A quiet weekend, an old house, and 2 pets to look after. It seemed like an easy way to make a little extra cash. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Callahan, sounded kind enough on the phone. She told me the house was a bit old-fashioned, but the pets were well-behaved. A golden retriever named Max and a black cat named Willow. She even joked that they'd be better company than most people. I didn't ask too many questions. After all, how hard could it be? Just feed them, take Max for a quick walk, and keep an eye on the place. But there was one thing she mentioned at the end of our call that stuck with me. She said, "There are a few notes I've left around the house, just little things to make your stay easier. And don't worry if Max or Willow seem a bit odd. They get like that in storms." I pulled up to the house just as the rain started to fall. It wasn't what I expected. The pictures Mrs. Callahan had sent me didn't do it justice. It was bigger, older, the kind of house that felt like it had lived through more years than it should have. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass slightly fogged over, and the porch creaked under my feet as I walked up to the front door. The inside wasn't much better. The air was damp, like the house hadn't been aired out in weeks. The smell of mildew mixed with something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned with every step I took. There was a grandfather clock in the hallway that ticked loudly, its hands moving slower than they should have. But what struck me the most was how quiet it was. No hum of appliances, no distant sounds from outside. Just the rain hitting the windows and the occasional groan of the house settling. Max greeted me first. He was an older dog, his gray muzzle showing his age. He wagged his tail lazily, but didn't bark or jump like most dogs would. Instead, he just looked at me, really looked at me like he was sizing me up. Willow, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. I didn't think much of it. Cats hide. It's what they do. Still, something about the way Max's gaze lingered on me made me feel watched. Mrs. Callahan had left a note on the kitchen counter. It was short and to the point. Feed Max and Willow at 8 p.m. sharp. Don't let Max out after dark, and make sure the basement door stays closed at all times. At first, I laughed. It felt like overkill. Why would I even go near the basement? I set my bag down in the living room and tried to get comfortable, but the house felt off. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak upstairs like someone was walking around. Max would lift his head and look toward the staircase. His ears perked up, but when I checked, nothing was there. I chalked it up to the storm, the wind, the old wood expanding and contracting. But then, around 8 o'clock, I heard the first noise I couldn't explain. It was a thud, soft at first like something had fallen, but then it came again, louder this time. I froze, listening. Max was already on his feet, staring at the basement door. His tail was low, his ears flat. I remember laughing nervously, telling him, "It's just the wind," but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I decided to check the basement door, just to put my mind at ease. It was locked, just like Mrs. Callahan had said it would be. But as I stood there, I felt it, something pressing against the other side. It wasn't hard, just a faint push like someone testing the door. Max started growling low in his throat, and I backed away, my heart pounding. That's when I realized Willow was sitting at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide, her fur puffed up like she'd seen a ghost. I told myself it was just an old house, creaky wood, maybe a draft. But that didn't explain the way the animals were acting. That didn't explain the feeling I got every time I walked past the basement. Like something was waiting, watching. After the first thud and the strange way Max and Willow reacted, I knew I wouldn't be getting much sleep that night. But the logical side of me, the side that wanted to convince myself this was just a normal pet-sitting job, kept me grounded. Or at least it tried to. I decided to get familiar with the house, see if maybe there was some logical explanation for the noises. Maybe it was just old pipes or loose floorboards. I convinced myself that if I understood the house better, I'd stop jumping at shadows. The first thing I noticed was how much of the house was locked. There were doors upstairs and down the hallway that wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I tried the handles. The keys weren't left out anywhere, and the locks themselves looked ancient, rusted over like they hadn't been touched in years. It made me wonder what Mrs. Callahan could possibly be keeping in there. Still, it wasn't my business, so I moved on. What was harder to ignore were the portraits. Every hallway, every room seemed to have one. A family member, I guessed, though I couldn't tell if they were supposed to be ancestors or someone more recent. Their faces were faded, their expressions somber. What stood out were the eyes. Each portrait seemed to follow me as I moved through the house. It wasn't just a trick of the light, either. I tested it, stepping back and forth in front of one painting in the living room. The eyes tracked me, dull and lifeless, but unmistakably watching. When I went back to the kitchen, I found more notes from Mrs. Callahan, tucked in odd places, under the salt shaker, taped to the side of the refrigerator, even inside the cabinet where she kept the dog food. They all said the same thing, though in different ways. Follow the schedule, feed the pets at exactly 8 p.m., and above all, don't open the basement door. One note, though, stood out. It was folded and tucked inside the cover of an old recipe book. It said, "If the pets growl or hiss, leave the room immediately. Stay calm, don't panic, and wait for them to settle." At first, I thought it was a joke. Maybe she'd had some weird experiences with the animals being territorial. But the way Max and Willow had acted earlier, it didn't feel like a joke. The rest of the night didn't do much to help. Around 10 p.m., the storm outside had gotten worse. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled against the windows. The lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd go out entirely at any moment. Max stayed close to me, lying by my feet, but every so often, he'd lift his head and let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the hallway that led to the basement. It wasn't constant, just enough to keep me on edge. Willow, on the other hand, kept her distance. She'd dart into the room for a moment, hiss at nothing I could see, and then disappear again. It was like she was trying to warn me, but I didn't know what of. At one point, I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book I'd brought, when I heard it again, that soft scratching sound. It wasn't coming from the basement this time. It was upstairs. I told myself it was just the storm, tree branches against the windows maybe. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, like something was dragging across the floorboards. Max stood up immediately, his ears flat against his head. He didn't bark or growl, but he stared at the staircase like he was waiting for something, or someone, to come down. I stood up too, my pulse racing, but I didn't move toward the stairs. Instead, I grabbed my phone and texted Mrs. Callahan. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just asked if she'd ever heard strange noises in the house before. Her response came almost immediately. "Don't worry about the noises. Just follow the rules." It wasn't just the noises, though. The feeling I got walking through the house, especially near the basement door, was heavier now. It was like the air there was thicker, harder to breathe, and every time I got too close, Max would growl low in his throat, his body tense like he was ready to protect me from something. I told myself it was just the storm, just my imagination. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. I decided to call it a night. I locked myself in the guest room. Max curled up on the floor by the bed. Willow was nowhere to be found. The scratching upstairs had stopped, but the house felt too quiet now, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in the house, not even in that room. By midnight, the storm had only gotten worse. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the old house to its core. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. But it wasn't. Max had started pacing, his claws clicking on the wooden floor, his head snapping toward the door every few seconds. And Willow, I hadn't seen her in hours. That alone wouldn't have worried me, but what happened next did. It started with the scratching. Faint at first, like nails brushing against wood. It was coming from the hallway, near the basement door. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear over the sound of the rain. There it was again, slow, deliberate, like whatever was making the sound wanted me to know it was there. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a loose shutter banging against the side of the house. But deep down, I knew better. Max stopped pacing and stood completely still, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. Then he started growling, low and guttural, the kind of growl that sends chills down your spine. He didn't move, didn't bark, just growled, like he was warning whatever was out there to stay away. I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped into the hallway. Max followed me, staying close, his growl rumbling in his chest. The air felt heavier out there, colder. I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight, which didn't make any sense. The house wasn't that old. It shouldn't have drafts like this. When I reached the basement door, the scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain against the windows. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, just barely audible, but unmistakable. It said my name. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding, and practically ran back to the living room. That's when I noticed something else. The objects in the house, they weren't where I'd left them. The keys I'd set on the counter were now on the coffee table. The chair I'd pushed in earlier was slightly pulled out. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make my stomach twist. I felt like I was being toyed with, like whatever was in the house wanted me to notice. As I turned to head back to the bedroom, I saw Max standing in the middle of the room, staring at an empty corner. His hackles were raised, and he was barking now, loud and frantic. It wasn't like before. This time, it was desperate, like he was trying to scare something away. But there was nothing there, nothing I could see. I spent the next hour trying to calm myself down. I locked every door, checked every window, and finally settled in the kitchen with a cup of tea. That's when I noticed the drawer was slightly open. I didn't remember leaving it like that. Inside, under a stack of old papers, I found it, an old, leather-bound journal. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The first few entries were mundane, notes about the pets, feeding schedules, nothing unusual. But then the tone shifted. One entry stood out, "Don't stay after midnight." The pets know. They always know. Another read, "If you hear whispers, don't respond. Don't let it know you can hear it." The final entry was smeared, the handwriting frantic. "The basement is the key. It's where it started. But don't open it. For the love of God, don't open it." After reading the journal, I couldn't sit still. I needed to find Willow. I searched every room, calling her name, but she didn't come. Max followed me, his tail low, his movements cautious. Finally, I found her in the upstairs bathroom. She was perched on the sink, staring into the mirror, her reflection distorted somehow, like the glass wasn't quite right. When I stepped closer, she hissed and bolted, disappearing into the shadows before I could catch her. Max was acting strange too. He kept circling the living room, barking at empty spaces, his eyes darting around like he was tracking something invisible. It was like the house itself was alive, and the pets were the only ones who could see it for what it really was. By now, the scratching at the basement door had become relentless. It wasn't soft or subtle anymore. It was loud, insistent, like something was clawing to get out. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help myself. I had to look. I had to know what was behind that door. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way back to the basement. The door was shaking now, the sound of whispers almost drowning out the rain. When I shone the flashlight on the door, I saw them. Claw marks, deep and jagged, etched into the wood from the inside. My hands were trembling as I reached for the handle. But then I heard it again. My name, whispered in a voice that wasn't mine, wasn't Mrs. Callahan's. It was softer, higher, like a child's voice. I yanked my hand back, my heart racing. Max was growling again, his body pressed against my leg, as if to keep me from moving closer. I knew I couldn't open that door, not after what I'd read in the journal. But the voice, it didn't stop. It kept calling my name, over and over, growing louder with every second. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I don't remember much about how I got out of that house. One moment, I was standing in the hallway, staring at the basement door, and the next, I was outside, drenched from the storm, clutching my bag like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. Max was barking inside, a desperate, mournful sound that I still hear in my dreams. But I couldn't go back for him. I couldn't go back for Willow. All I knew was that I needed to get away. The driveway felt a mile long, and the rain was so heavy I could barely see the car. My keys slipped from my shaking hands twice before I managed to unlock the door. When I finally started the engine, I glanced back at the house. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I saw them. Max, standing at the window, barking, his eyes wide with panic. And Willow, perched on the windowsill beside him, staring directly at me. Her eyes didn't look like a cat's anymore. They looked human. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my hands still trembling on the wheel. The officer at the front desk gave me a strange look when I stumbled in, soaking wet, rambling about noises and claw marks. They sent a patrol car to the house, but when they called me back the next day, they said there was nothing to report. No claw marks, no basement journal, no pets, just an empty house. They asked if I had been drinking, if I'd imagined it all. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'll never forget the way Max and Willow looked at me as I left them behind. I tried to move on. I really did. I went back to school, avoided late-night jobs, and tried not to think about that weekend. But no matter how much I distracted myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me. It started with the dreams. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing whispers in the dark. Then came the noises, the faint sound of scratching at my apartment door like claws scraping against wood. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I told myself it was just raccoons or stray cats. But then one night, I looked through the peephole, and they were there, Max and Willow, standing in the rain, staring up at my window from the street below. Max barked once, short and sharp, as if he was calling to me. And Willow? She just sat there, her eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. I closed the curtains and locked every door and window in my apartment. But the scratching didn't stop. It hasn't stopped. Every night, I hear it, soft at first, then louder, closer, like they're reminding me of the promise I broke. The promise to protect them. And now, as I sit here, writing this, I can hear it again. The scratching. Only this time, it's not at the door. It's coming from inside the apartment. If you enjoyed this story, There are many more waiting for you. Stories of shadows, whispers, and the things we leave behind. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the unknown. Sweet dreams if you dare.